Russians must urgently prepare for total darkness, cold, and hunger. Now, every strike on Ukrainian energy facilities comes back to Russia tenfold. The Ukrainian armed forces are methodically burning down Russian thermal power plants and the critical energy network of the aggressor country. The response comes instantly and hits hard. So Kremlin officials are once again rasping about force majeure.
More and more Russian cities are plunging into darkness. If Russians attack the Ukrainian energy system, Ukraine will attack the Russian one. The Ukrainian authorities warned about this, and the defense forces have demonstrated it clearly.
They blew the roof off.
For example, this is what the Voronezh thermal power plant looks like now. It was attacked on November 9th. Reports say there were at least 3 hits. After the explosions, part of the city was left without electricity.
Voronezh is quite a significant city. Voronezh has a lot of enterprises that operate there, including electronics companies. There are also aviation and military enterprises there.
This is exactly the difference between Russian and Ukrainian strikes on the power system. In addition to a deserved response, the goal of the Ukrainian defenders is to plunge into darkness those energy infrastructure facilities that support the operation of Russia's defense industry. This is
the dual purpose, specifically for both situations. First, it's really to show Russia that they're not the only ones who can do this. We can respond in kind to certain things as well. And indeed, to attempt to stop their powerful machine and undermine the military-industrial complex that is actively working against us in this war.
I think this trend will continue. At first glance, to peck away at the liver of the Russian energy system, this is how various elements of the infrastructure will gradually be knocked out. At first glance, it might just seem satisfying that somewhere in Belgorod or Voronezh people had to sit without electricity. But let's think about it. In some ways, the configuration of the Russian energy system might be similar to ours in the sense that the same power lines can supply not only the residential sector, but also, for example, industry and railway transport.
That's why none of these attacks are random. The goal is not just to respond, but to respond painfully so that the facilities supplying power to the military-industrial enterprises of the aggressor country cannot fuel the Kremlin's ambitions.
When various elements of the integrity of the Russian energy system are gradually undermined, it primarily means that somewhere a train carrying something the Rashists need for the war will come to a halt, or there will be scheduled power outages at a factory producing goods important to Russia.
And according to experts, not all such enterprises are located deep in the rear. Many facilities are located not far from the Ukrainian border. For example, strategic bombers Tu-95MS are repaired in Taganrog, and one of the manufacturers of components for the Russian missile program, specifically solid fuel for the Iskanders, is located just 150 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. Plunging them into electrical darkness is quite possible. There are undoubtedly such important facilities for the Russian military-industrial complex in the Moscow region as well, and for that matter in Moscow itself. I
think that the psychological factor, when Moscow is plunged into darkness, it will be much more effective than just shutting down a few factories there. Because it's precisely this main mass, what's it called, the office plankton, who live off the regions. Finally, even they will realize that something is happening and that something needs to be done.
In this way, Ukraine will kill not 2 but 3 birds with 1 stone at once. A just response, the paralysis of Russian military-industrial facilities, and psychological pressure on the Kremlin. This sounds like the perfect goal for the next blackout.
Breaking news, Kazakhstan has gone on the offensive. A country that was under Moscow's iron grip just yesterday is now demonstratively breaking free from the Kremlin's orbit. It meets with Trump at the White House while looking down on Putin with disdain. How the former empire lost yet another ally. What this means for global geopolitics and for Ukraine. More on this in our report.
Kazakhstan, once friendly to Putin, is now supplying weapons to Ukraine. Octavian Berceanu, former head of Romania's National Guard for Environmental Protection, claims he was offered 10 million euros for a deal to import ammunition from Kazakhstan. The Russian-made ammunition was allegedly intended to be repainted and sold to Europe for further delivery to Ukraine.
Kazakhstan is distancing itself from the war in Ukraine. Moreover, at one point, Ukrainian President Zelensky stated that he had offered the Russian dictator a meeting in Astana. To this, the president of Kazakhstan responded that his country is not a mediator between Russia and Ukraine. But if there is a political necessity, then accordingly, Kazakhstan will provide its own territory for such an event, for a meeting at the level of the heads of the two states.
According to Berchanov, he reported the offer to the criminal prosecution authorities and the National Anti-Corruption Agency. At the same time, there was allegedly talk of another matter, the opening of a weapons or ammunition factory on the territory of Romania.
At the moment, it should be noted that Kazakhstan has chosen a strategy of lobbying between the interests of its key political partners. These are first and foremost the United States, Russia, and China. It should be noted that despite Kazakhstan being a CSTO country, and moreover, the Tokayev regime having come to power essentially on Russian bayonets, Kazakhstan is currently pursuing an almost independent policy from the Russian Federation.
Meanwhile, following the Central Asia-US summit, Kazakhstan concluded deals worth $17 billion.
We are talking about rare earth metals. First of all, about tungsten. In addition, agreements on cooperation in the field of IT technologies and a possible memorandum on the sale of 3 Boeing aircraft were signed.
The president of Kazakhstan believes that the current US administration has a greater understanding of the importance of Central Asia, and he praised Trump for his more accommodating approach toward Russia. At the same time, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev calls a ceasefire in Ukraine possible and even praised Putin for his flexibility.
Kazakhstan was, in fact, the first OPEC member country to increase oil production despite significant challenges at the time. Kazakhstan is trying to make progress and improve its situation by working on a range of important issues that affect the country and its people. The government is putting in effort to address challenges, support development, and create better opportunities for its citizens.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Urgently, the Ukrainian armed forces are delivering precise strikes on key military targets in Crimea and Donbas. And these are no longer just attacks, this is preparation for the great return of Ukrainian territories. Every detonation surge says one thing: a breath of freedom is getting closer. The evidence is presented in the following report. A unique operation that lasted for months ended with a spectacular explosion in the middle of Donetsk. According to locals, nothing like this has ever been seen before in the occupied territories. Where did the strikes land? What was destroyed? And most importantly, what did the Ukrainian armed forces use?
Judging by the special effects and the massive explosions, Flamingo missiles were used.
So let's go through everything step by step. Last night, a powerful explosion rocked Donetsk, after which, according to eyewitness videos, a fireball rose into the sky. It looked just like a huge nuclear mushroom cloud billowing up into the sky in a dramatic and frightening display. And the force of the blast was so intense that windows were shattered and blown out in buildings throughout the area.
Several kilometers away from the epicenter, the effects of the explosion could still be observed, highlighting the significant power of the blast. First, there was an initial explosion, and then, after a brief pause, a second explosion occurred. You can clearly see this in the footage, a glowing, rapidly expanding wave of energy that moves outward from the center. This dramatic visual effect demonstrates the intensity of the event. In other words, it was a very successful strike on the Donetsk warehouses, which resulted in substantial damage to the targeted area.
A bit later, the head of UAV systems for the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Robert Magyar-Brudi, shed some light on the situation. According to his information, the strike hit a large warehouse of Shahed-type drones, where warheads were also being stored.
The development of this complex target turned into a painstaking intelligence operation that lasted several months. It was pieced together from small fragments like a puzzle. Last night, it was carried out using appropriate strike assets by the Special Operations Forces and the missile troops of the Ukrainian Defense Forces.
Analysts note that despite the long range of the Shahed drones, it was extremely important for the Russians to keep the warehouse for these drones close to the front line. After all, when the occupiers launch UAVs just a few dozen kilometers from the line of contact, the Ukrainian armed forces simply don't have time to respond quickly. As a result, the drones carry out their terror in frontline cities and also strike at the forward positions of our troops.
The destruction of logistics for the supply of shells and missiles for the drones to the Pokrovsky direction, to Pokrovsk itself, is now very important for us.
However, our command chose not to disclose what exactly the defense forces used for the strike. One thing is certain, drones definitely took part in the attack, but something else followed them in.
As the footage from there shows, it was clearly not just drones at work. From what we can tell, the UAVs were distracting the local air defense. But the finishing blow was delivered by something resembling a rocket. It might have been a drone or possibly a missile.
The fact that missiles were indeed used is also supported by Madhyar's reports about the participation of Ukraine's missile forces in the attack.
I don't think the Shahed warehouse was unprotected, that it was just some hangars. Most likely. They were talking about some kind of underground bunker. And that's another reason why I think these were flamingos. Of course, they could have used Storm Shadow as well. Storm Shadow would have been suitable here too. They have an anti-bunker capability. Nevertheless, the scale of the detonation shows, or at least that's how it seems to me. If you look at the very first second, the explosion was clearly bigger than just a couple 100 kilograms of a Storm Shadow warhead.
So yes, most likely it was indeed our Ukrainian flamingos. By the way, this is already the third time just this week that they've inflicted massive damage on the Russians. But in Crimea, such power wasn't needed, so drones were sent to attack the peninsula. In occupied Simferopol, around 2:30 in the morning, a fire broke out at an oil depot. Presumably we're talking about Krimneftezbit in the area of the village of Bitumnoye. There were also reports of 4 strikes in Gvardeyskoye, after which smoke rose into the sky. There, the hits likely targeted the local thermal power plant, which temporarily ceased operations.